Hey, hello everyone, John Simons here, PPG Grandpa. Today's guest is Will Liddy. He has been on the paramotor scene for a couple years. I'm going to let him tell you what's going on, but let me give you a quick rundown. He sold everything he had, bought a $700 car, drove from Wisconsin to Illinois so he could get training, lived in his car, and every night for 6 hours he would learn. He would read, expanding his knowledge on equipment, techniques, and the people inside the sport. He's also appeared in the Ask Aviator live stream, and he also worked at Aviator. So anyway, let's get on with the show. Will, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
Hi, Sean. Doing well.
Well, tell me a little bit about yourself.
All right. I just turned 20 about 9 days ago, and I've been involved in the paramotor world since I was 18. I don't exactly remember which YouTube video it was that got me into it, but I think about 5 videos deep, I was already committed to selling everything I had. So I was into flipping cars at the time, so I sold all the cars that I had, 2 of them, and used that and the money I had kind of saved up in the bank, booked my training, and bought a $700 car and drove from New York to Illinois and slept in that for a week while I learned to fly paramotors. And after that just kind of kicked off a big, huge journey, a lot of traveling around the country, a lot of crazy adventures. And I've in the 2 years that I've been doing it, I've had, it's amazing how fast life moves in this scene. I mean, it's I've done things that I never would have pictured.
It sounds like you are pretty dedicated to PPG. I mean, you slept in your car, you sold everything that you had, just so
I do that pretty often. Yeah. It is essentially my entire life at this point. Yeah. And I want to make it even more so. I'm looking to get started at instructing at this point. I've got an arrangement with somebody to go and work as a instructor assistant here this summer. So I'm always looking to bank more experience, start getting some more credentials and ratings under my belt, and start giving back more into the sport.
All right, so there are a bunch of questions out there that newbies ask all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you some basic questions, and you can just answer them the best you can. Like, I've heard this a lot. What kind of helmet do I need, and what kind of comms do I need?
Well, so helmets are great because there's an entire spectrum. You can be very bare bones, or you can get something that's, an N-Bolo or similar that's, over $1,000. Me personally, my setup, I built for about $60, I'd say. And what it consists of is it's a Bell skateboard helmet. And originally I had 3M Peltor earmuffs for ear protection. What I've since gone to is on Amazon, there's ear protection that's rated for a shooting range. And it's got Bluetooth built into it, so it connects to your phone. And it's also got a mic. So that's what I do personally with my friends, is we just call each other on the cell phone, and you've got Bluetooth comms that way. You can use it to listen to music, and it's a nice bare bones solution. What a lot of other people use is the Cenas, which is basically built for the motorcycle community. And that's very similar to Bluetooth as well. Definitely a little bit more of a preferable solution. As to needing comms, that's, I wouldn't say that you do until you start flying into most of the time. Of course, 99% of the time we're in G&E airspace. But if you were to get permission to go into controlled airspace, you would need an av band radio in order to talk.
So how much so you're saying that helmets vary from $60 all the way to like $1,000 or more, correct? Yeah, quite a range. So it's pretty much whatever you want to do. I mean, there's no correct answer for what kind of helmet I should get.
Yeah, You want to get something that offers you some good protection, I would say. But the nature of our sport is, if you are to take a high impact, most of the time it's not. You want something to, I mean, there's been injuries and even fatalities from head impacts. So I never go out without a helmet. But when I was first starting off, I was using a full face motorcycle helmet, which is incredibly bulky, incredibly heavy, and restricts my field of view. So I think that the skateboard helmet is a nice medium, because it's still got that impact foam. It's made to take a header onto concrete and leave your skull intact. So you've still got that aspect of protection, but it's a lot more lightweight and a lot less restrictive, and very easy to modify with cameras and communications, etc.
I also have earplugs that I put in. I put in earplugs, and then I put on my normal. What do you call those? What do you call those on the helmet? The things that go over your ears.
They're just called earmuffs. I think some people use Peltors as just a generic name. That's a 3M brand. It's kind of like calling it tissue and Kleenex.
Okay, yeah, the Peltor. That's what I was thinking of. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, yeah. So I've noticed that I need to have more hearing protection. I need to have the those little red things that you go in your ears, like the normal hearing protection, and then the earmuffs over on top, and I feel pretty good. Is that about how you are too?
Yeah, I find if I've got a good set, like the Peltors are rated for however many decibels. As long as you have a good pair of earmuffs that's actually rated ear protection, I think that's enough. Definitely, ear protection is a pretty critical item, though. I don't think people really fully understand how damaging sound is over time, but these machines are definitely loud enough to do it.
Exactly. Now, there's a lot of people that are asking about apps. I mean, most people understand that Windy is like a really good one, but what are some other ones that you used, and why would you use them?
So there's all different kinds of apps. The ones that I use besides Windy on a daily basis, there's one called UAV Forecast, which is really great, because that one, you open it up and it just tells you at a glance a lot of the information you want to know. It actually has a kind of a bar at the top that says good to fly or not good to fly, and you can set the parameters such as wind speed, direction, visibility, etc. That also tells you winds aloft. A lot of people like to use RyanCarlton.com, but this thing just gives you everything kind of in one spot. And it also has, it's not a sectional chart, but it gives you a map that displays airports of all sizes, heliports, and it also displays TFRs and NOTAMs, which is really important. Now, a lot of people never check NOTAMs or TFRs before they fly, so having that is really nice. It makes it basically to where there's no excuse not to.
Now, I use Sky Fly High. Have you used that before?
I personally haven't, no.
Okay. It seems like it has a lot of good stuff. I mean, I think it's another $7 and you get all the different maps and stuff that are included with it. So seems to be pretty good. So what are some other ones that are good for you that you enjoy?
When I'm on cross country, I use PPGPS.
I got that too.
I bought the pro version of it. And that's nice. I really like something that displays your track. And before I got that, I was basically just using Google Maps, but it's pretty difficult to navigate using Google Maps because it's obviously not made for something that flies. But PPGPS, it's really nice to be able to set a waypoint, especially when you get up and you've got like an overcast and you got maybe 2 miles visibility. If you're doing a 40-mile cross country, it can be very nice to have that. Like yesterday, I went on a flight with my local crew yesterday where we were probably, I'd say, about 500 to 600 feet above the ground, and the visibility was probably about 2 miles. We were in Class G airspace, of course. Visibility is probably about 2 miles, and you can navigate by sense of direction only so much. And I didn't know the area. I was flying from an unfamiliar airport, so it would have been nice to have just something there to give you vectors back to your destination. So that's a useful one. That's got all kinds of features too. It's got like a fuel calculator built into it. where you can kind of, it's a rough estimate, but you can input what your efficiency is and how many gallons you're starting with, and I guess based on the time, it'll estimate how much fuel you have remaining. So that's a cool feature. And besides that, I use, before every time I go up, I check Doppler radar, and I just use my local weather app from Channel 13 here in Rochester. That, of course, just gives me a Doppler radar so I can see if there's any cells moving my way. And even if the cells don't pass me directly, they can still kick up a gust front. So it's really nice to be able to visualize that.
Awesome. Now, are there any magazine subscriptions that would be really good to get?
Yeah. One is when you have a EAA membership active, you can also get a subscription to Powered Sport Flying magazine, which is really good. It's that's made by Jeff Goen, as well as others. A lot of good articles in there, and what I particularly enjoy each time is there's always a piece on safety in there. Sometimes it's accident reports, or sometimes it's just advice on how to keep yourself safe. So I always find that very valuable. I read that every time. And there's been articles reporting on big fly-ins that have gone on, and it's not just for paramotors too, it's for all ultralights. So you find pieces in there on some of the fixed wing ultralights, powered parachutes, gyros, etc. So it's really interesting. I mean, it's more of a magazine just for ultralight enthusiasts in general, but a large part of it is for powered paragliding.
Now, everyone wants to know what's the cheapest way they can get into the sport, and what's the cheapest amount of, or the least amount of money that they have to spend to get into the sport. What do you think that would be?
Well, my default answer is you can basically get in to an extent as cheap as you want to, but the cheaper you go in initially, the more money you'll end up spending over the long term.
I've heard that all the time. Why do you think that?
Well, to give you an example, when I first started, my very first purchase in this sport was a 23 or 25-year-old paramotor. It was a Lomwet brand paramotor with a Solo 210 engine, had no prop, had no gas tank, and the frame was more than a little tweaked. That was $1,000 that I basically just I was able to make it back, but that was basically lighting $1,000 on fire when I could have put that towards training, which is the first big purchase you should be making. That's really what you should be putting your money towards. And as far as gear goes, I've seen people get incredible deals. I've got a friend locally here that bought a running motor and a flyable wing for $1,500.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. Now, see, what you have to understand is that's pretty rare. You're most likely not going to get any kind of good equipment for that kind of money.
Right.
The motors, it can really be hit or miss. I mean, sometimes you'll find a motor for cheap that runs amazing and it'll give you hundreds of hours of. One thing, of course, to keep in mind is the cheaper motors are likely going to be old, which equates to heavy. So if that's an issue for you, it's the motors that are out there now are incredible as to how lightweight they are. I mean, we're talking, some of them are under 40 pounds, which is incredible. I mean, the gear that I fly right now, my motor is from 2006 and my wing is from 2011, and for those two together, I paid $2,500. I bought them separately, but total together it's $2,500. But that I've spent many thousands in this sport so far over the 2 years that I've been into it. I mean, a lot of times you'll hear a number that it's $8,000 to $10,000 worth of gear and $2,000 to $3,500 for training. You can get initially a lot cheaper than that, but if you'll never really stop spending. I mean, especially if you really go deep into the sport and you become enthusiastic about it, you'll be spending a lot of money.
Yeah, my very first motor that I got was $3,000, and then I put $500 into it. for a maintenance kit and a carburetor, and it works like a champ. And then I decided to get a different frame and put that motor on the new frame, so it's pretty much a whole new paramotor that I got, which is pretty cool. How about Airspace? What's up with this Airspace? It sounds like there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So there's a whole alphabet of Airspace. Can you dumb that down just a wee bit?
Sure. The great thing about Airspace is the vast majority of the country is either Class G or Class E, which is 2 pieces of airspace that we can fly in with basically no restrictions. When you step up in G airspace, you need a mile of visibility and you need to stay clear of the clouds. That's about it. I mean, there's other, obviously you have to follow restrictions that are in place, just being ultralights. So in training, I mean, if you've got a good training setup, they should be teaching how to read a sectional chart, and they should be going over FAR 103 and making sure that you're familiar with those. But the A, B, C, and D airspaces, those are all restricted, and most of the time that has to do with airports. Class A airspace is anything above 18,000 feet, which is where the airliners are flying. That's all IFR, totally restricted to us. Of course, you can't really breathe up there anyway, so it's not that huge of a deal. Class B is like a big international airport. And those are the ones, what a lot of people, I think a lot of people miss out just by virtue of not knowing how to read the sectional chart, because the Class B airspace, if you were to visualize it in 3D, it looks like an upside down wedding cake. So there's actually concentric layers of airspace called shelves, and you can fly under the shelves. There's just an altitude restriction there. The problem with that, though, is most of the time, since Class Bs are large international airports, the shelves will be over congested areas. So that's out of the question in that case. But if you know how to take advantage of, or if you have the knowledge to really know where you can go and where you can't go, there's a lot of places that are open to you. I'd say easily 95% of the country by total land area is flyable here.
All right, so how about as far as like transporting the paramotor? What is a good way of doing that?
Well, there's quite a few ways. Me personally, I have a sedan, just a normal car, like I'd say most people out there have. I just put a trailer hitch on it, and I use a $50 cargo rack I got at Harbor Freight. And if I'm just going short hops, I'll just throw the motor on there. But one thing I have noticed is that is a ton of extra drag on the car, and I get terrible fuel economy. So if I'm going anywhere over 10 miles, I'll just disassemble the motor, put it inside the car. And if I have the opportunity to buy a pickup truck, I'll just throw it in the back of the truck. Either option works really good.
All right. So disassemble it, put it on a trailer or a cargo rack.
Yeah, any one of those works. I've seen people that hop on a skateboard and run the motor on their back. That's an option too.
Hey, this is what the podcast is all about, options.
Yeah.
All right. So is there any type of requirements like a license or anything like that that's required? And how about insurance and tags? I've heard of, tail numbers. Do we need any of that for paramotoring?
Nope. Currently under FAR Part 103, we don't need any of that. No license, no insurance, no N number, which is really great. That's a big part of the freedom that our sport provides. And as long as your aircraft falls under Part 103, which I believe is 55 knots or under calibrated airspeed, under 250 pounds, and with a gas capacity of under 5 gallons, I know there's more, but off the top of my head, that's a Part 103 aircraft. Oh, and single occupant only, all of which is a paramotor. What's funny is you can see like powered parachutes, which look very similar to paramotor trikes. Those actually require a light sport license, and they're N numbered as well. So I mean, they don't look much different, but it's a different class of aircraft. But nope, for us, under Part 103, no license.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, what kind of training is required then?
Well, you technically don't require any training either. You would just be very heavily advised to get some, because you are, of course, strapping a spinning death blade onto your back and running into the sky with a piece of cloth. So I think anybody in their right mind should probably go ahead and get that training. It's your life is worth every bit of $2,000.
I totally agree with you. All right. So with 5 gallons, how far can paramotors go?
Well, that depends on a lot of factors. One is what winds you're facing, and two is what wing you've got, and three is how thirsty your motor is. And I would say that's in descending order of importance. If you've got, if your airspeed of your glider is 25 miles an hour and you get up 800 feet and you're facing a 25 mile an hour headwind, you're going nowhere. So you'll basically be hovering in one spot for forever. Conversely, if you were to go up to 10,000 feet and get yourself a 50 mile an hour tailwind, you'll be covering ground like crazy. Because if you've got that same 20 mile an hour airspeed, you're now traveling 70 miles an hour. And I've heard of people that can go 250 miles on a single tank on one leg of a trip, which is really good. But again, it's highly dependent on the conditions, and there's wings out there that are incredibly efficient. I mean, I went from a beginner wing to a semi competition wing, and I run at least 2,000 RPM less at cruise. So I mean, that's another important factor. But I'd say on average, if you're going up on a calm night, you'd never. I haven't heard of anybody foot launching with 5 gallons. That is like a crazy amount of weight. You would have to have a back far stronger than mine in order to do that. But I've launched with 3.5 to 4 before, and I've been able to fly for 2.5 hours easy on that.
So we talked about how much they weigh, under 250 pounds to be under the FAR 103 ultralight, but how much can they carry, and how long does it actually take to learn how to fly?
All right. Well, there's I've never heard of any paramotor that's over 100 pounds. Well, no, that's not true. I have, but just about 99% of paramotors out there today, I'd say, are under 70. Definitely nothing approaching 250. That's just the FAA's rule. But I'd say on average, your average paramotor out there is about 55 pounds dry weight nowadays. As far as instruction, what was your second question? Sorry.
How much could they carry? Like, I jump in and I want to take some luggage with me, like the Icarus race, So how much weight can one of these things carry? I mean, can it carry 100 pounds, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds? What can they carry?
That's pretty highly dependent more on the wing than the motor. If you've got a larger wing, you can obviously there's people that can do tandems, 2 fully grown adults. There's people that are launching wheeled carts that are heavy plus their body weight, and typically the heavier guys are the ones that tend to launch on wheels. So 500 pounds is definitely not out of the question. You're not going to be able to launch 500 pounds with an 80cc motor, but I've seen people regularly do wheeled tandems with the Moster 185, which is just about the most common engine out there. So more dependent on your wing than your motor, but they're capable of handling some serious weight.
And how long does it take to learn how to fly?
So on average, the courses are at least a week and up to 14 days. I'd say that's what it takes to really fly with confidence and be able to effectively handle everything yourself without instructor supervision. You're usually soloing on day 3 or 4 on most courses that I've seen. For me, I believe it was day 3. And if you've got a good course, those 3 days have been filled with entirely ground handling, learning how to control the wing, and some sort of flight experience before that, either a tandem or towing. I find towing to be the best. It's a very safe, very easy, very quick process to learn how to control the glider in the air before you strap that expensive motor onto your back.
Speaking about motors, what happens if the motor fails when you're flying up in the air? Do we just fall down to the ground and die, or what?
Nope. That has happened to me more times than I can count, and I have never been injured, and I have never broken gear from a motor out landing. If you are, one thing that we constantly try to drill into people's heads is when you're flying, you have an out in mind at all times. And what I mean by that is you wouldn't want to fly at low altitude over a huge forest because you are depending on a two-stroke engine that's, weighs 25 pounds and is pumping out, 20 horsepower or something crazy like that. They're incredibly high strung. They're very prone to breakage. They do break, and it is a completely non-event if you are doing your due diligence as to having an outlanding in mind. Now, that is the case most of the time. If you are to have a motor out right after launch, then that can be a bit more severe because if you have a sudden loss of power, you get a surge with the wing. So if you're on the spot and you're constantly expecting the motor to fail at all times and you're able to catch that surge, you can land safely even in that instance too. That's happened to me before. I know people that's happened to, and none of us have ever been hurt by it. But it would be
that's good.
very possible too. You can, like everything, it's something you have to be anticipating.
Now, I know somebody asked how fast can you go, and you already told us that the fastest that we can go is 55 knots legally, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Now, does that mean if I have a 100-mile-an-hour tailwind and I'm doing 100 miles an hour, is that illegal?
No, because that 55 knots is airspeed. Airspeed and ground speed are two different things. I touched earlier on if you're facing a headwind, you can have zero ground speed, which is hovering in essence, or if your headwind exceeds the airspeed of your wing, you'll actually start flying backwards, which can be a little trippy. But no, the 55 knots is calibrated airspeed only. The way I like to, whenever I'm talking about air and trying to explain how that works, I always try and use water as my analogy because they behave very similarly. And if you are to take a boat and try and go upstream or paddle your kayak upstream, it's a lot harder, even though your kayak is actually still moving in the water at the same speed. The water is opposing you. And it's the same thing when you go up in the air. You're always, unless the wing is stalled, you're always flying at that airspeed or trim speed, we call it. So, like I said, if you've got a wing that's 25 miles an hour for airspeed, if you've got zero wind, you're going to be flying 25 miles an hour across the ground at all times. If you've got a 20-mile-an-hour headwind, you're going to be flying 5 miles across the ground. And if you've got a 20-mile-an-hour tailwind, you'll be flying 45 miles an hour across the ground. So that really illustrates the importance of wind direction, especially if you're planning a cross country or something.
That's really interesting. So these things take regular unleaded, or do I have to go to the airport and get aviation gas? What do these things take as far as gas?
Yep. So what I always recommend is anything above 90 octane, and I try and avoid ethanol. That's my recommendation. I know people that run 100 low lead aviation fuel. I know people that run 87 octane with ethanol. The best bet on that one is to consult your manufacturer of the motor and see what they recommend. But me personally, I try and shy away from the ethanol, and I try and give myself a high enough octane ratio because these motors are high compression. They're usually about 11 to 1 compression ratio. And if you've got too low of an octane, you'll start getting detonation, which is not good.
Oh, what's detonation?
That is when the motor or when the gasoline. So you know how a diesel engine works. The diesel engine has no spark plug. It ignites by compression only because when air compresses, it heats up.
Yep.
That kind of happens with the gasoline engines, and the combination of the heat, the residual heat from the motor, and the compression of the motor pre-ignites the gasoline. And when you've got an explosion, in essence, opposing the piston when it's still rising in the bore, the explosion is meant to happen when the piston is at top dead center, because then it's ready to go down again. When you've got that explosion happening while the piston is still rising, that can be super detrimental, especially to the wrist pin bearing. In the dirt bike world, we used to have that all the time, and the effects of it are not very good, and I've seen motors blow up from it before. It also runs a lot hotter.
I don't like motors blowing up on my back. So there's ways of cooling them, and I know that you have to put 2-cycle oil. What kind of 2-cycle oil do you recommend?
So I'd say the most popular is AMSOIL products, whether that's Sabre or Dominator. Me personally, just as a carryover from my dirt bike days, I run Klotz Super Technoplate, which is a 20% castor oil blend. I've always had good luck with that. But I would say, again, consult either your dealer or the manufacturer and just follow their recommendations. And not only is that because perhaps it'll run the best for that particular engine, but that'll give you much better standing when it comes to warranty, is running their recommended oil.
Okay, so I probably shouldn't go and get the cheapest gas and put in Walmart's 2-cycle oil, correct?
Yeah, in your $8,000 investment. Yeah, that's what I always say when people tell me that they intend to run cheap gas or cheap oil. It's like you just dropped $8,000 on something, and now you can't pay an extra $1 per gallon at the pump, and you're only paying for 4 gallons anyway. And the oil is like maybe $15 for a quart or a pint. I'm sorry, quart. It really does not amount to much. I spend hardly anything on fuel, and I burn probably close to 5 gallons a week on these. I have a VP gas can, 5 gallons. I fill it up on Monday. It's usually gone by Saturday. So, and to fill that thing up, it only takes about $12.
How long should I keep the gas in my gas tank if I don't do a lot of flying?
Interestingly enough, I always said about a week to 2 weeks is about my limit for gas. The manual of my paramotor says 72 hours, which I think is a little bit excessive.
Did you say 72 hours?
That's correct, yeah. I've definitely run gas that's a lot older than 72 hours, and I've never had an issue. I suspect that's maybe a bit of a CYA thing on the part of the manufacturer.
Right.
I think that's a little bit way too conservative of an estimate, but I would say 2 weeks, particularly if you're running gas with ethanol. That's one of the reasons why I try and shy away from ethanol, is because it's hygroscopic, which means it attracts water, and that's not a problem as much if you're keeping it in an airtight container. Like my gas can is totally airtight, but the fuel tanks of the paramotors aren't. And so if you've got ethanol fuel in there for a while, you'll open up your carburetor and find it full of when it gets really bad, it looks like rock candy. It crystallizes and causes all kinds of corrosion. And for a carburetor that consists of 2 rubber diaphragms that are supposed to be pumping fuel from, a foot below, these carburetors are made for chainsaws. People don't really understand. They're not purpose designed for aviation, and they're not designed to really suck fuel through 3 feet of fuel line from a tank that's a foot below the carburetor. So they're already overworked as it is, and they're also very highly sensitive. I mean, a quarter turn of the high screw leaning it out will blow up your engine. The unfortunate thing is, the most common carburetor issue causes fuel starvation, which causes your motor to run way too hot. Anything from nearing the fuel line to the diaphragms not working correctly and not pumping fuel adequately to a clogged up filter screen, any of that will cause a lean condition, which is what we try and avoid at all costs.
Would it be better to run like 87 non-ethanol gas opposed to maybe 93 with ethanol?
Well, if you're going to be using all of that 93 that flight, I would say go with the higher octane. But if you plan on keeping it for a little while, I would take the hit on octane to not have that ethanol in there. Yeah.
Okay, because that's kind of what I'm doing, because it kind of seems like it's up in the air when I'm able to fly or not.
Right.
All right. So I've also had somebody ask me, do you get motion sickness or dizzy when flying a paramotor?
Me personally, I have never experienced either one of those. If you're somebody who's prone to like getting vertigo, maybe that might be an issue. Which is why I always try and recommend people to go up tandem, especially if they're kind of on the fence or they're not entirely sure if that's something that they're physically going to be able to cope with. I always recommend doing a tandem just to kind of make sure that you're good for it. But no, even in rough air, I've never had any kind of motion sickness or dizziness. The one thing I will say for when you start getting a little bit more advanced is if you've never experienced G-force before, when you do your first couple of big wingovers, it's really an interesting feeling. It's sort of tunnel vision isn't really the right word, but it sort of feels like your field of vision gets sort of pulled back a little bit, like your eyes are being pushed into your head. It's really an interesting feeling. But that's the most abnormal thing I've ever felt from paramotoring. No sort of motion sickness.
All right. With that weird thing that you just said, somebody else also asked, how dangerous is power paragliding?
Well, as with many other things, it is about as safe as you make it. You can fly in the most perfect conditions. You can be incredibly conservative with your decision making. You can not make any steep maneuvers. And you'll probably never run into an issue. But for those among us that have a little bit of a daredevil streak, it can definitely get pretty dangerous, and it can sneak up on you, which is why I always preach that complacency kills. It can be very easy to just, grab it out of the garage, not do any kind of pre-flight, run out there because you want to hit the good wind and go out there and cut it up with a bunch of steep maneuvers, but eventually it will catch up to you. So there's a sliding scale of skill and risk, and you want to keep them in equilibrium all the time. There's an expression I heard one time. It's called the 2-bucket theory. You have a bucket of skill and a bucket of luck, and the objective is to fill your bucket of skill before the bucket of luck runs out. I think that's pretty accurate. Everybody, especially when you're first starting out, I don't care what anybody says. We all have situations where we luck out. There's been times where I've been up in trashy air, and at the time I didn't really have the skills to active pilot and cope with that, and I was like, man. When I get my feet back on the ground again safe, I'm like, man, I really lucked out that time. But what's great is I can learn from those experiences. I know what my limits are, and I'm not so eager to push them anymore.
So let's say that somebody wants to get up with you. Do you have any social media out there that people can go check out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super active on the Facebook Paramotor group. Besides that, I'm one of the moderators over at subreddit Paramotor, so I'm all over there all the time. That's basically what I do all the time, is answer questions just like this. That's what I enjoy doing. And my Instagram, which is pretty mediocre, but that's... I go by Dust Devil with 2 underscores on either side. That's, if you find me on Facebook, all the links are on there.
Well, I'll go ahead and post all the links down below. Just send them to me, and I'll post them on this podcast here. See, there was something else I was going to ask. Oh, I remember. I was going to ask you, since you are a moderator of the Paramotor Reddit group, you wouldn't have any problem with me posting this podcast on there, would you?
Oh, no, not at all.
Cool. I'll go ahead and post that for sure.
There's basically the one rule over there is like, don't be a dick. That's we don't really care if people post their stuff. It's not an issue at all.
Oh, good. Good.
Are we off? It's just you and me, right?
Oh, it will be here in a second.
Okay. All right.
Now, what if I want to take my paramotor someplace? Now, I live in Central Arkansas. Let's say I want to go to the Bahamas, and do some flying down there. How do I pack up a paramotor and go someplace using an airline?
Well, when you're discussing airlines, first off, the wing is no issue. That you just check that. The motors, then it starts getting a little bit more hairy. You've got two things you have to dodge. You have to dodge FAA regulations, and then you have to dodge the airline itself. And the FAA, first thing, there can be no trace of gas. So you have to be really, really careful with how you clean out the carburetor and the gas tank. I know people that have actually been forced to buy another gas tank so they have one that's perfectly clean, and then they fly with that. And then again, there's some airlines that are cool with that, and then there's some where there could be no motor parts at all. There's some where they're fine with engines, but only if the engine's never been run before. I mean, there's big, huge dance. So best bet is to read up on that and pick your airline accordingly. And then I've heard of people using some loopholes, like they partially disassemble the engine, so then it's only considered parts and no longer a functioning engine. I've never personally had to do it, so I'm probably not the best authority on that, but that's what I know.
That's interesting. Yeah, I heard that people will buy a brand new gas tank and take it with them and disassemble their motor. It just seems to be kind of a hassle. Is there any other way that you can transport your motor someplace? I mean, can you ship it through mail maybe?
You can, yeah. I've shipped whole paramotors through USPS and UPS. Somebody online, I don't exactly remember who it was or where it was, but they were saying something about Fastenal, how Fastenal offers a shipping service that's like cheaper, and they ship their paramotor with it. I don't know.
I heard that too.
That would be one to look into, but that would be a really interesting solution, I think.
So in other words, if you're going to be flying, you might want to get yourself a good car, put a cargo hitch on the back, and just go. Yeah,
that's what I've always done. I've had mine all over the country. Actually, me and my local crew are going down to Florida end of February rather. We're gonna have all kinds of crazy adventures. But yeah, that's our solution. Is there are a couple people flying down, but they're going to be giving their motors to the people who are driving, and we're going to take it down for them. So.
Now, another thing that people are always asking is, like, how much room do you need to take off for a beginner? Now, is there a certain rule for that? Is there a amount of space? How does that work?
Like a lot of things, also highly dependent on what your conditions are. I'd say as a beginner, you want basically no obstructions in front of you. And that's twofold. A, so you don't physically run into them. Like you wouldn't want to launch into out of a field that's got a bunch of trees at the end, and it's a short field where that would be a concern. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, if you've got wind, the trees create rotor and churns the air up and makes it really nasty and unstable, and that ultimately goes up the higher wind speed you have.
Right.
So I would say for a beginner, just about most parks out there that have soccer fields, the soccer field itself is usually more than enough room. Then you just want to make sure your path is clear of obstructions there.
Now, you said rotor. There's rotor from trees and stuff, and then there's mechanical rotor or something like that. What is that all about?
Rotor or mechanical turbulence, and any object. I'll use the water analogy again. If you know how if you take a flowing river that's got a rock in the middle, how you get those little eddies and white water behind the rock. That's what air behaves like too, and that'll happen with anything from buildings to trees to hills. So it's very important to keep that in mind. I mean, a lot of times, like I launch from my house a lot, from the fields we have here, and they're kind of in a bowl. which makes it a little bit challenging because, you know, like the wingsock can be completely dead. I'll take out, and as soon as I climb above, 70 feet, all of a sudden I'm getting buffeted by turbulence because it's deceptive down here. So that's one thing to keep in mind too.
Now, how old do you have to be to actually fly paramotor? I heard that kids are doing this, and I heard that 90-year-olds are doing this. Is there an age limit?
Yeah, no, there's no age limit on either end. The youngest I have personally seen and heard of was my instructor, his daughter.
Oh, hold on. Sorry, technical difficulties. I actually dropped the phone. Sorry about that. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Yeah, there's no age limit on either end. I've seen kids as young as 12 foot launch, and I saw a really interesting video of a guy. I believe he was 88 years old foot launching, which is pretty incredible. That guy was in great condition. But yeah, no age limit. Basically, if you're physically able to do it safely, there's age is not an object.
What is physically able to do it? What kind of physical requirements do you need to have to be able to foot launch?
If you can lift and run with about 55 pounds on your back, I'd say you're good.
55 pounds. That's like a big bag of dog food or a big bag of rice. How much is 55 pounds?
I'd say a little bit more than your average bag of dog food, but the standard, if you go to a gym, the standard weight plate, the big one is 45 pounds. Pick that up and then add 10 more. That's what your average paramotor weighs. And
that's pretty heavy, but putting it on your back, it's not as heavy as just lifting it.
Yeah, and there's motors out there. A lot of it is design too. I mean, I've seen motors that are incredibly ergonomic. It doesn't feel like anything, and I've seen motors that are actually lighter, but they feel much heavier just because of the way the weight is distributed. They've got the motor kicked way out, so it's leveraging against you and making it feel heavier. And then, of course, the more gas you add, the gas tank sits low on the frame on most of them, so that's adding to it as well. But the static weight, 55 pounds, and of course, like I said, there's units out there now. Like the most common one in my town right now is the Parajet Maverick Atom 80, and that one's like 45 pounds or something. It's crazy light.
And when we say 55 pounds, we're not talking about running with 55 pounds across a field. We're talking about 55 pounds in every step that you take because the wings above your head gets lighter and lighter.
Well, when the wing starts building lift, then it takes the weight of the motor off your back first, which is actually when a lot of people get into trouble because then they try sitting down and they sit too early. But I'd say on any given launch, the weight is only on my back for probably about 30 to 45 seconds because I have to put the motor on, stand up, walk over to the wing, clip in, and then I take... After I inflate the wing and bring it up, I take usually no more than 10 steps before I'm off the ground. That's with proper posture. Of course, as a beginner, until you build that muscle memory and get that proper posture, usually it can take anywhere up to 25 to 30 steps or strides to where you get off. But the weight is usually not an issue. When the weight becomes an issue is when you start getting fatigued from multiple attempts. Like if you are blowing launches. I had a rule back in the day when I was blowing launches where it would be like 3 strikes. If I would fail 3 in a row, I would sit out and take a breather for like 20 minutes because it's really easy to exert yourself too much and then your legs will give out from under you. That's not a good situation to be in.
Yeah, I think that's actually what happened to me. I noticed that I was doing a lot of bunny hills and practicing. And when I took my first flight, when I came in, my legs were kind of jello. I think I wore them out way too much. So I totally agree with you. You definitely need to be careful, make sure that your legs are not jelly beforehand. Another thing that I noticed too is coming in for a landing, I would butt land. I can't remember how many times. The first 5-10 times I would come in and kind of like bump the cage. But recently I've heard and I've learned I guess I forgot something, is to look at the horizon as you're coming in, and then as you're coming down to flare. And I float in like a butterfly now, looking at the horizon. So why, when I look down, it doesn't work, but when I look at the horizon, I do like perfect landings?
So object fixation to that, and if anybody's ever taken a driving course, usually that's touched on too. But object fixation and depth perception. So when you're looking off into the distance more, and that is particularly the case if you're landing over snow or anything reflective. You wouldn't be landing over water unless something has gone horribly wrong. But in the wintertime, we would land on frozen lakes where it's just glassy white snow everywhere. And it's really, really difficult to get depth perception over that. So you have no choice but to look out into the horizon to determine how low you are and when's right to flare. I'd say with practice, like I don't fixate on any one thing when I'm coming in for a landing. I don't really look at the horizon. I would say I actually am looking at the ground, but usually that's because I'm over terrain where I can clearly see, and I have other objects to reference. Like I've got trees around me, so I can pretty easily tell how high I am and when to flare. And another thing that people don't really realize about landing is a lot of the wings that are safe that people are starting out on, the beginner wings or the ENA, they're by nature, you can't have everything, and a lot of times to achieve that safety, there's some sacrifice in efficiency. So when I stepped up to a spicier wing, my landings improved tremendously because I had so much more energy that I could bleed out and swoop across the ground. And I just land like a butterfly now. The beginner wing, I had landing dialed in. I mean, I never would bump the cage or anything, but it's my opinion that the beginner wings can actually be harder to land than the more advanced ones.
That's interesting. I would definitely like to touch on the different wings, A, B, C, and what that's all about. But guys, before we continue this, if you would like to be on the podcast here, you can get me at ppggrandpa@gmail.com. Now, if you have a great story, or if you want to be interviewed, or you have even done an interview, you can send it to me through the email that I just gave you, ppggrandpa@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I've been doing so far as visual, I do have a YouTube channel, and that's ppggrandpa.com. How about that? Now, if you have questions, please let us know. We're going to have a bunch of different experts or people that really know what's going on to answer your questions. All right, I got that. Now, the ratings of the wing, you just said that the A wings might be difficult, and there's what, A, B, C, D. There's a bunch of alphabet with wings too, just like there is with Airspace. It always seems to be alphabet. So when it comes to the wing, what are we actually talking about when we hear A wing? And real quick question before we go into that, I heard that my Roadster 3, it's a B wing. However, because it has trimmers and it has tip steering, it cannot be considered an A wing, because it has the option of going out of an A. So if I kept my trimmers in all the way and I didn't touch the tip steering, would that be kind of like I'm flying an A-wing?
So that's really interesting, because how that certification process works, and first thing you have to know is there's several testing houses that do this. When people are saying A, B, C, that refers to EN. There's also DGAC, which those are both in, I don't actually know what those acronyms stand for because they're both in foreign languages. DGAC, I believe, is German. But there's some ratings that are strictly load tests, and then there's some where there's actually a test pilot that goes up and does various maneuvers, stalls, and assesses how the wing recovers. And there's a set of criteria that each wing is judged on. And if any single category, like let's say you've got a wing where it's rated A in 9 out of 10 categories and rated B in 1 out of 10 categories, that still becomes a B wing. So a lot of wings out there that are people say, oh, this is an ENB. A lot of times they're still really safe. The Universal is one, the Spider and Roadster is another. Those are all very safe and pretty good for beginners. I'd say the Spider and Roadster, from what I've seen, that's good for anybody that's got more than 10 flights. A lot of times, like at Aviator, for instance, you're starting out on the Mojo, but especially for some of the more gifted students, a lot of times by 10 to 15, 20 flights, they're on the Roadster or the Spider.
That was actually my first wing, was my Roadster 3. And it seemed like a very solid. I mean, it feels like I'm strapped underneath my rafters in the garage from the ceiling. I mean, it feels that solid. I can't imagine feeling more safe, even though I'm in a B wing.
Yeah, it is a very reassuring wing. I've flown the Spider, which is the same wing in lightweight fabric. It's very reassuring. I was very impressed with that wing. It performs very well, and it is very stable and reassuring. I didn't have it out in any turbulence or anything, but it was very reassuring. Lands great too. Retains plenty of energy.
Yeah, I've had no problem with it. I really like it. I'm just now starting with, pulling out the trimmers a little bit and experimenting with that, and maybe doing some using the tip steering. So that's been pretty cool, man. I can pull that and do some serious bank. I'm like, wow, this is cool.
Yeah, when you the other thing that's cool with those is when you get a little bit more experience and you're ready for it, you can tie in 2D. And that's a lot of people say that's like adding power steering, and it really does make quite a noticeable effect, that 2D steering, because it gives you a lot more options as to how you want it. So like when you pull straight down, the tip engages first, so you get a lot more dynamic turn that way. And you can also sort of extend your arms outwards, and then engages the main brake only for normal turn that you're used to. Or you can also pull your arms in sharply towards you, and that engages the tip only, and that gives you, the tightest turn bank. I've flown 2D wings before, and it's really nice for sure.
I really like it not tied in, because I can fly the way I want to with my brakes, and then I can grab, with my finger the tip steering, and then I can do more with it, and then I can let it go and just fly with the brakes and not worry about it. But that's another thing that somebody has been asking, and I believe it was on a Facebook post. It just blew up tonight. It was about wing overs. Should you learn to do wing overs for safety reason, like getting out of the sky, or should you just not learn wing overs and this acrobatic stuff?
I mean, it's certainly not required to do wing overs or any acro. If we have descent methods that are a lot safer than doing wing overs, you can do big ears, and if big ears is not enough, you can do a beeline stall. I'd say one that maybe would be worth learning is the asymmetric spiral. Flat spirals in this sport are very dangerous, because there are wings that can lock you into a spiral,
right,
and you'll black out. Yeah. So the asymmetric spiral is sort of more like an elliptical movement, and you can descend very quick, but with little to no risk of blacking out.
So that asymmetric, that's how does that work? I mean, what does that mean?
It means that you're not spinning consistently around the axis. You're sort of pumping the brake a little bit as you're turning, and it makes it so you don't have any sort of constant pressure when you're rotating around. I guess the best way to describe it would be like if you've got like a piece of paper balanced on top of a pencil. If you're just spinning the piece of paper and there's no elliptical movement to it, that would be like doing a flat spin. And if you've got a little bit of gyration to it, that's like the asymmetric spiral, and it makes it so you don't get consistent G-force. So you can't black out.
So when would be a good time to take an SIV course? I mean, how many hours should you have under your belt before you take one, do you think?
I've heard people say you should wait 100 hours. I've heard people say you should take it right after training. I'm of the mind that I think sooner is better than later, especially if you're somebody that's going to be out, flying midday or doing things of that nature. But the SIV, they can teach you crazy advanced maneuvers, or it can just be an environment where you can go up and have a voice on the radio and pull some collapses and do some maneuvers. And I think having that confidence in knowing how badly the wing wants to fly and how much that they're capable of taking, I think that's really important to have. I haven't done one yet. I really want to.
How about a reserve? I know that a lot of schools don't want you to have a reserve when you first fly because you get bumpy airs, like you get scared, and throw a reserve. So
that's a real danger. I mean, I didn't get a reserve until I had probably about 125 hours in.
Oh, really? That long?
Yeah. I've never seen a school that sends students up with reserves, and that there is quite a bit of danger. I mean, there's videos out there of people getting into some sort of situation, panicking and throwing the reserve, and then the wing inflates right before the reserve opens, and then they've got a nasty situation on their hands.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, man, I tell you what, we have crested an hour, and dude, this was so good. I can imagine. There's so much to learn. I thought I knew a lot because I read a lot. I watched all the YouTube videos. I went to school. I thought I knew a lot until I started talking with you and these other amazing pilots out there, and I learned that I don't know nothing.
Well, wait till you get Jeff going on here. That's I'm really a small fry compared to some of the names that you've had on here. So that'll be really fun. I'll be tuning in for that one.
Yeah, I think Jeff said that he has a big project this month, so maybe the 1st of February-ish, I'll be able to get him on there. Hopefully by then I'll get this microphone thing set up and have some good questions to ask.
I'll be tuning in for that one for sure.
All right. Well, man, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. You have been another wealth of information. Hopefully a lot of people got a lot out of this podcast. If you guys out there want to ask questions, we're going to have a ton of people on here. We actually have a lineup. You wouldn't believe how many people have come that want to be on this podcast. We need your questions. We need your stories. We need you to be on here too. So if you want to, ppggrandpa@gmail.com and let me know. Man, thanks once again. You have a great evening, and I'll talk with you soon.
Thanks for having me out. Have a great one.
All right.